All right, everyone, time for another installment of Comic Talk. And today we're actually talking about two closely related subjects, chemical and atomic superpowers. And essentially, the reason why, they're kind of linked together is just because you kind of have to know what basically your base material is and then what you want to turn it into. Now, it always seems like people always want to turn lead into gold instead, and that's always pretty simple. That's definitely more of an atomic power. I mean, there's actually a way that people can turn mercury into gold, but it takes so much effort to actually use a certain machine, and I said that the amount of gold you get won't even break even. And even if one was to maybe say, okay, let's try to make like platinum or something, they didn't really say anything about that, but who knows what it would actually would take. But essentially, the human body is one gigantic chemistry set with various trace elements. I said coming through our bodies at all possible times. I mean, there are people that have to take like various supplements. I know that my grandmother pretty much has like a periodic table, like kind of cocktail that she takes in her older age, and that's one way to kind of put it. But if you're going to go like being a chemical based character, here's what you need to know. First off, you got to know what kind of chemical formula is, in the fact that um, you may not always get the desired result, or in this case, you're wondering does this work. Two easy compounds to kind of think about are water and salt. Now, water is basically two hydrogen atoms and then one oxygen atom put together. And yet they're both gases, and actually, if you were to split them apart, they actually be quite dangerous because they'd be much more flammable. Yet it becomes pretty much the opposite. It comes water, which pretty much is used to put out a lot of fire. And then with salt, sodium is a metal. Pretty much a lot of things, you know, on the periodic table, pretty much from the left side, is a metal of some sort. It's kind of weird to actually think about it, you know, and yet to think of it, everything pretty much is a metal. But that said, and chlorine is actually a gas. Okay, you know, I mean, most people just think like chlorine is like in water, for pool treatments. But while it does have the properties, it's not pure chlorine, which actually would be very toxic. And yet, in this case, salt is just a bunch of very small cubes instead of white cubes, and you never know. And sometimes, the smallest change could actually become quite dangerous. Um, Oddly enough, they actually had this toy back said from like maybe the 60s or 70s called the Magic Pistol. And essentially, what you would do is you would put certain types of crystals in there, and then water, and that essentially would create an actual explosion. And all those things were actually found in the human body. I mean, won't tell won't tell you what actually it is. I mean, you can look it up yourself, but I'm not gonna get in trouble with YouTube for that. Um, so you don't really think of it as anything too serious, but once they start to mix, you never know. I think in this case, the fact that our stomachs actually has hydrochloric acid, that's actually pretty corrosive. But if one was to replace hydrogen with sulfur, that's even worse. There's nitric acid. Um, that's also pretty bad. And they also mentioned, like in the Mummy movies, something called like salt acid, in which if you ever see a person kind of like engulfed by like some kind of cloud in a few scenes, that's apparently what it is. It's not like a massive steam vent. It's just the fact that it reacts so with the air. I mean, things like sodium and potassium will essentially, you know, will react poorly with the air and often are stored in oil where they can't do anything. So if you're basically trying to come up with something to actually use, I mean, it's one thing to just say, okay, here's a bunch of hydrogen atoms, and I squeeze them together to make helium. Which actually, until say a couple years ago, I didn't actually know what helium actually was. It was actually a byproduct of radiation. So, but the idea is the fact that everything is made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So if you know what the atomic number is, that could be more of a thing. But the idea is just the fact that, certain things really aren't as complicated for whatever you. But the question is, do you actually have to absorb the trace elements first, or instead to use later, or you're someone like Metamorpho from the DC universe, who seems looks very awkward, but they actually showed him producing kryptonite just out of the blue. And they never really established, if kryptonite was anything special, kind of like in the Arrowverse, and the fact that it required a massive hydraulic press just to crush. But yet, really couldn't, they didn't really say what exactly it was made out of. And during actually the final battle, he had to actually synthesize a bunch of chemicals to actually beat to be a giant monster. But thing is, they don't really tell you what the thing is. So it seems like maybe he just can. But if you're only relying upon what's in the human body, you could still have a few options. One thing, naturally, things like hydrogen would allow you to float around pretty good, a nice vapor trail. Sorry. And I said it could be something there. And if you actually were to, we're somewhat resistant to extreme temperatures, you could actually produce liquid nitrogen. And essentially, in which the strangest thing is that on its own, it's not. It's one of a few elements that actually has to be there. I mean, so in this case, things like hydrogen, chlorine, oxygen, is there. And the idea is the fact that if you put enough of the enough of these, nitrogen molecules together, apparently they start to stick to each other, and that's what actually creates liquid nitrogen. But if you actually are talking about adding things differently, look at hydrogen peroxide. All it really does is just has an extra oxygen atom thrown in. And I said, pretty much is just glorified, water, and eventually, it will just pretty much turn into water, because there's nothing truly keeping that extra oxygen atom, in place. But if in this case, if you were to go from like O2 to O3, that makes ozone. And apparently, while it's good, to protect, us from, cosmic radiation, apparently humans aren't really actually meant to breathe it in. Just as in this case, there's actually something called D2O, which is known as heavy water. A small, drink of it is not there, but because it's not what the body is used to, it can be quite dangerous on its own. So, yeah. So in this case, if you probably would have to be a pretty good chemist to actually know what everything is, because some things, when the wrong thing mixed together, it's not going to be a pretty thing. And some elements like gold really aren't all that reactive with anything unless you have a catalyst. So you would have to find, in theory, would have to know what everything is on the fly. And sometimes that could just, get in the way. So even if you were somehow like a walking, like basically chemistry lab, kind of like Gut Rot from Ben 10 Omniverse, that could definitely be quite helpful because it seemed like that was actually an intelligent alien, because he was actually able to create like some kind of, memory wiping gas to use on Dr. Animo. And Ben was always portrayed as not being that much of a scholar. So then again, it always seems as though he was just basically a bunch of gas. So so if you needed some kind of liquid, um, material, it wouldn't have been there. They never, of course, they barely even used him as like one of the last aliens he ever unlocked. So there wasn't like, way to say, oh, this is how he can actually, just hold up his hands and make water out of nowhere or some other random compound. So in this case, I know that actually when they had like Space Ghost in the Galaxy trio, there was a character that came from a planet that was, able to use multiple kinds of chemical weapons. So in theory, you could have someone that, absorbs various amounts, and then then you just simply duplicate it in some kind of capacity in some kind of subspace, because essentially, you know, most of what we actually are is just empty space. So in theory, you could actually store it in there in like or maybe like a pocket dimension. But so in theory, it seems like they just are able to have that. And then that's also been one of the biggest pet peeves I actually have about sci-fi movies, where they say, "Oh, we can't identify the metal," or "This metal does not exist on Earth." And I'm thinking, oh, it said there's only so many elements that could ever possibly exist. Mostly because the more the denser a molecule, said atoms and molecules actually become, you know, the faster the electrons have to go, and eventually they would pretty much would be right at the speed of light, and that's pretty much like the threshold. So saying that this is the newest element, there were only going to be so many said left. And in theory, is that you know even if this he said even if the civilization is far more advanced, the idea is the fact that the atomic structure follows the same thing. If you just have one proton and one electron, you actually have make hydrogen. But when you start throwing things in, like here's 14, said here's 14 protons, 14 electrons, and so many neutrons, you actually get silicon. So and you, so in this case, they really wouldn't say, "Oh, this is a rare, everything." It's like it's really one of the most basic of things out there, and that just doesn't seem to be, possible. It was kind of a little off the thing, but you get the idea, and just in terms of the fact that, some things are easier to make than others, but you never know what exactly um, you're gonna get. So that's kind of where atomic powers comes into play, and the fact that if you need something like iron to be there, it said but you maybe only have like aluminum, then you would have to pretty much figure it you have to pretty much figure out that aluminum is not nearly as heavy as titanium, or no, iron. Yeah. And so you may get the same general amount, but it could be represented as a very small um, version of it. So you need so much more, um, and you just never know what exactly would happen. But then that's actually where the isotopes may come into an issue, and just the fact that one isotope could actually be pretty stable, and one other isotope isn't. I mean, in this case, basically technetium is an element that is responsible for making X-rays, but it doesn't really last very long on its own. It literally will just go for a certain point, then just immediately start to decay into other elements, and that can definitely slow things down if you're really needing to, if you really need it to do a lot of things. Just as in this case, it's one thing to turn lead into gold, but you don't want to go the other way and actually make mercury, which in this case is actually highly toxic. And it pretty much seems like it's toxic in all kinds of forms. Because on a TV show, they actually found like an old cinnabar mine, and for dramatic emphasis, they make it seem as though they were about to go in there, but it's like, don't. This is why, and it was just like, it's mercury based. So you just never know what everything's going to be. So in this case, cinnabar is just a red gem that sorry that does have toxicity. But if someone says mercury, you pretty much think of what's in an old school thermometer. So there are definitely many different versions of everything, and just making something on the fly may require a bit more know-how. And even if you do know how to make know what the chemical formula is, you might actually be dealing with something. If there's like very complicated shapes, that could definitely be a problem, because they actually said a character in The Incredibles, while you definitely could make a bunch of things, bicycles were something he said were a little bit too complicated for him. And even then, all he could really do for for organic, then, but he couldn't do anything with actually organic material other than maybe healing small wounds. So you could actually have really bad razor rash, and he could just basically wave his hands over, and that might be the extent. So there has to be some kind of limits to everything. And then again, so you never know what exactly is going to happen. So actually going back to the chemical parts, you would want to make sure that if you're going to make something on the fly, you have to know what the pH is, because it's not. Everyone always seems to think that the lower the pH, the more corrosive it is, but it's pretty much at the maximum. At the end, lye or sodium and potassium hydroxide are definitely very basic, but you put them in the right condition, like adding water, it's a problem. Because they actually showed it on CSI Miami, where a guy was just pushing the pool like out of petty spites, and the guy was practically boiled alive. And like glass beakers weren't able to hold it. I guess that's considered organic enough, so they actually had to use plastic beakers to essentially, contain it to figure out what's going on. And then they just decided to actually just pour a whole bunch of vinegar in, and that was enough to neutralize it. So while acetic acid isn't really too bad, what we get for like food is hardly much of anything. They're actually what is known as vinegaroons, which are a type of, which are related to scorpions, but they have like a massive whip-like antenna that essentially will produce a far greater concentration. It's kind of like how when they show like how you can water something down and no one will notice. That's pretty much what happens with vinegar. But the idea is the fact that the more concentrated something actually is, it can be quite dangerous. So that is definitely a pretty serious issue. And then people will, so you do want to kind of know what you're doing if you are going to make anything, on the atomic level. But, and then, there could be way too many applications, for that, both sides, like when they showed like Cradle to the Grave, they showed here's our special, plutonium, and it said, and they've made a small chunk, that was supposed to be insanely dangerous. But they said, normally this is accomplished by adding neutrons. We're taking away protons, and I'm thinking, well, hopefully you know how to take away just enough protons, so the fact that everything that's affected doesn't immediately change to something else. And if something goes wrong that doesn't cause like a meltdown, it could possibly turn into lead or like tin just out of nowhere because you maybe did everything wrong. So let's see something else that would definitely would be so. When it actually comes down to atomic powers, a lot of people always ask, what's the difference between atomic and nuclear? For me, nuclear is just generating different types of radiation. And while in this case, certain forms of radiation like alpha and beta can actually affect the influence you know, of things, and I think that's actually how they turned that one scientist was able to turn mercury into gold, because depending upon which way it goes, you may either add to the atomic structure to the number of protons, or you deduct from it, and that's enough to basically have and it will change into whatever. So if you were just simply were to say, oh, this is horribly radioactive stuff, but you could actually so in this case, you might actually someone with nuclear power might be able to drain enough of it, but an atomic person that would be immune to the thing would just say, okay, you know what, we actually need some pretty serious tools to be made. So I'm just going to tell this, radioactive, something like maybe uranium, and it becomes a solid chunk of chromium, and there's no radiation whatsoever, or no more radiation than what you would get from the background, because there are essentially some things are naturally a bit more radioactive, like apparently bananas are. Then there's just the natural radiation from the sun, but it's on such a low threshold that it's hardly much of anything. And so unless someone basically injects you with like radioactive dye for a medical procedure, that's really not going to be the thing. Because while in this case, you know, normal forms of radiation may not be there. Like that, I learned in school that like alpha particles barely require much of anything to block it. Beta is a little bit more, but when you get to things like gamma, that's when you need like a whole thing of lead. And even when, so if you actually have to talk about something that being very radioactive, but the radiation doesn't go far, look at the guy who drank a lot of Radithor, which was essentially a health drink that was with nothing more than water and radium. And it's safe from a certain distance, but you can still detect the radiation, but it's like the particles barely go far enough to actually affect anything, like what happened with Chernobyl, and said, or like a solar flare, or no, not a solar flare, like Northern Lights. So yeah, because a lot of people kind of seem to use like atomic and nuclear kind of thing, and if you're actually talking about maybe making something like Godzilla's atomic fire, depending on what era, like if you're actually talking about like the old school ones with a man in a suit, for me that could just be the fact that he is breathing something, but it's essentially accelerating. So the fact that it becomes plasma, which is actually what stars are made out of, and maybe in this case it doesn't take that much to actually for the process to be made, so that everyone can see it and they realize, oh, it's dangerous. But if you were to take a Geiger counter, it's like, no, it's nothing else. It's like, it's just some kind of, it's no more different than other kind of flames that when certain chemicals are added to them, will essentially, affect the color, I actually didn't know that copper was actually blue in certain forms, like in its raw forms, and actually helped make like blue fireworks. And if you're actually testing for something, sodium will be this nice yellow color, and potassium is actually blue, purple. So everything kind of has their own unique little things, and it definitely is unique to actually learning about what exactly makes up the world around you, and just the fact that simple things can change it, because they always said was told the fact that if if you were to basically melt, boil, or freeze something, it's still pretty much the same thing. But if you're talking about things like cooking, or fermenting or burning, that is definitely a chemical change. The first one was a physical change. So yeah, so it definitely would be kind of interesting to actually just even have some of those powers at one's disposal, but you never know what it could be, because in this case, you don't need a person that's nothing but gas, but and just a little bit of water is able to neutralize it, effects. There's actually laughing gas. That actually said if someone even is totally tripping out on it, from like the dentist or a leak of something, all you really just have to do is be exposed to water, and that it instantly takes it away. So you never know what it could be, and maybe so with like water, it could actually be may actually dilute everything, so it's hardly much of anything. So you never know. But then again, they actually say like on the outer planet, it's the moons of like the gas giants, and actually the gas giants themselves. It's so cold there that you could actually have an entire ocean that's actually made out of gas. It's just nothing but gas. And I said no, not gas, but it's like something like nitrogen or some other chemical like methane. It's actually so cold that it just naturally condenses. So it could definitely go underneath that change, so quickly. But the question is, what exactly would you ever use it for? Because there really isn't like just like in this case, you know, like Superman, leaping over a tall building with a single bound is okay, but when you realize he can actually fly, what's the big deal? Why would you even want to use it? You know, but if you were someone like Mr. Incredible, who actually can, does have some degree of jumping abilities, that would definitely would be that's very different. And it's like, what would you need like a massive, amount of tin instead, unless like creating tin, or maybe a very simple like something like, or in this case, a bunch of basic, a large amount of helium, and you're not, making balloons or filling up a blimp. It's like, what exactly are you hoping to actually do? I mean, the closest thing I would say is that to make other noble gases, because when they always say like neon signs, it does actually burn differently. But things like but you do have other things like xenon, radon, krypton, and so they definitely will burn very like different gases will definitely burn differently. And if you could actually create them, that's fine. But in the long run, what exactly you're going to do? So that's actually all I have to say about the main thing. But here's actually something very interesting, a bit of science lesson for everyone. One of the reasons why they actually look for water for on other planets is the fact that it kind of defies the universe, and the fact that it's actually slippery on its own, like it's actually slick. Because if something's just frozen, you could actually say, yeah, there's no difference between aluminum, silver, or even like titanium, when it's in that state. It's, if you try to skate on it, it doesn't. But I actually think that's kind of like, I just call that the layer of defiance, just because that's, this is where it's supposed to be. It's supposed to basically start becoming, gaseous when it heats up, but but actually it doesn't. But another thing, but it's actually the fact that because water actually freezes from the top down, you could have an entire ecosystem that's underneath it that could be fine. You could have like volcanic vents. There could be some degree of, maybe like tropical areas, just in terms of like, the Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn, that may not actually be nearly as, cold. So there is a chance for things to actually live on it. And in this case, when it actually comes down to other chemicals, they freeze from the bottom up. So any chance for life there would not be possible, just because it would force everything up from the bottom. If anyone has ever seen like a video of a brinicle or brinicle, whatever how you want to pronounce it, it might as well be caught in something like that, but you're being pushed up to the surface, so you'll actually just be gone, from that world altogether. So water is definitely simple. But it still actually has its own unique things. So I hope everyone has a good one. Won't tell you what the next video's topic is, because it's actually a little bit on the special side. But it will give you a bit of a headache. The more you listen to everything, and you're thinking, oh yeah, that's a problem, and that's a problem. You'll understand why that having such powers is very dangerous, even at the best of times. So hope everyone has a good rest of their week, and I'll see you guys very soon. All right, bye.